They accuse Elon Musk of being unelected, but all the people they want to make the decisions are unelected. But they're not just unelected, they're unaccountable. Musk is accountable. Trump has hired him and Trump can fire him, and Trump was elected. They want unaccountable bureaucrats that can't be removed.
What's happening around the world matters to you and will impact your life here at home. Learning lessons from other nations, particularly in the West, good lessons of things they're doing right, and mistakes that they've made so we don't replicate them here is critical to being informed and making the right decisions here at home. Looking at the United Kingdom is a perfect example of that. We have an incredible history between the United Kingdom and the United States. Everybody knows that. The countries really share so many different things. But there's so much that's different between the nations, not only the way their government system is set up as a parliamentary system, of course, they have the monarchy as well, but even culturally, things, while they speak the same language, are quite different. And if you look at the images from the United Kingdom over the last year and a half, especially since the war in Israel and Gaza have broken out, and you see images of tens of thousands of Muslim men marching, you see the rise of radical Islamism on the streets throughout the United Kingdom. There are no-go zones in cities and areas and neighborhoods that people won't walk through, that the police are not enforcing the laws. We saw earlier this year, Elon Musk tweeted about the grooming gang crisis, which are mass rapes that have been happening across the United Kingdom. They haven't been prosecuted to the level they should be. For some reason, they're brushing it under the rug. The reality is the mix between the progressive left and radical Islam is a recipe for the end of Western values. A few months ago, we had Douglas Murray on the pod, and he wrote the book, A War on the West, and he's been an incredible voice for Western values. He's been fighting on behalf of Israel. No, he's not Jewish, but he sees the impact of what's happening there on the West. He's also been a loud voice against the mass migration in the United Kingdom and in Europe and what it will do to European society. And he speaks a lot about this exact issue and how that will be the end of the West unless Europe stands up and does something. Our next guest today is Liz Truss. Liz Truss served as Prime Minister of the United Kingdom in 2022. She was in that position for less than 50 days. And the question is why? It's hard to understand when you look into it. Liz Truss came in, she was the leader of the Conservative Party, and she proposed tax cuts. She wanted economic growth. She wanted to deregulate things that today are just sort of run-of-the-mill conservative fiscal policies, but she couldn't do it. In fact, there was immediate panic from the markets, from the bureaucracy, from the public, from absolutely everybody. So much so that she was pressured to drop out. We speak about that today to try to understand why it was so difficult and it remains so difficult to implement conservative fiscal policies in the United Kingdom. We talk about the rise of radical Islam, their national security failures and illegal immigration in the United Kingdom, how it's impacting their society. Her book, 10 Years to Save the West, similar to Douglas Murray's book, talks about that she thinks that they're still behind the tipping point. They still have time to save the United Kingdom. I'm not sure that's the case, and we talk about that some in the pod. We also discuss the United States and United Kingdom relationship and how Trump and the Labor-led government in the United Kingdom will be able to get along. The idea of really pushing a trade deal is discussed. We also talk about how the current Prime Minister, Starmer of the United Kingdom, suspended arms sales to Israel and what message that's sending to his fringe within the United Kingdom. And really, is that really still a fringe if they're the ones leading policy? We see so many parallels, right, of what we've seen here in the United States. And then finally, we speak about whether or not Jews are still safe in England and the United Kingdom. A really interesting episode. Really want to keep everybody informed, not just of what's happening in this country, but what's happening all over the world. It's a great honor to have had Liz Truss here in the studio in Miami. I think you'll enjoy this episode. This is Standpoint, and I'm Gabe Groisman. Liz Truss, thanks so much for joining us here today.
Great to be here.
First of all, it's incredible to have you here in South Florida, former Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. It's really, really an honor to have you with us. Been following what you've been doing from your stint as Prime Minister, but even the time after. I've see you everywhere. Whether it's on social media and conferences. Tell us a little bit about what you've been doing since your time in the Parliament.
What I've been doing is really talking about what needs to happen in order to save the West. I wrote a book last year called 10 Years to Save the West, because what I discovered is when I got to the top of British politics was that I was unable to enact conservative policies, partly because of the bureaucracy, the unelected state, but also because the conservative movement itself had lost its essence. It's lost its reason for being. And I think that's very detrimental to Western civilization. I think we're seeing the same things have happened in the United States. I'm very pleased Trump has got in, but we saw America heading in the wrong direction. The Hamas protests on campuses, the environmentalists trying to undo successful US energy policy. In continental Europe, we've seen Islamic attacks, we've seen a failure on mass immigration. So what I wanted to say is, unless we actually get a grip, unless we transform our states in the West, unless we return to those core values that we believe in and Western civilization itself, then we are finished. So what my mission is now is to change things.
And how have you found your ability to effectuate change from outside of government versus your 14 years inside of government?
You might be aware that Britain has been taken over by a communist government, and we are living under socialism. There are attacks on free speech. People have been jailed for Facebook posts. We've got a huge economic problem. We're headed for a big economic crisis, potentially ending up at the IMF if the country runs out of money. We've got a big problem with our criminal justice system. The perpetrators of appalling rapes against girls in the north of England have not been properly brought to justice. There's been a huge cover-up. So the country is facing massive, massive problems. And the next election is not likely to be until 2029. So I think that the task now is to talk about what needs to happen to really make things change in Britain, because the country's just been drifting in the wrong direction probably for 40 years, if not longer than that. And we look over the Atlantic and we see what Trump is doing, what Musk is doing, and that is the type of thing we need in Britain. But it's going to take time to build the movement, to build the media, to get the plan together to actually deliver that.
Help us understand here on this side of the pond, as they say, what happened. Now, you made your way up to the leader of the Conservative Party. You were prime minister, but it lasted less than 50 days. If anyone takes a dive into it from our perspective, and really there's things we don't understand, which is why I'm asking you. It seems like you came in, you proposed three things. You said growth, growth, growth. You wanted to lower taxes. You wanted to really implement, when you look at it, pretty typical conservative fiscal policies. And the world, in the UK at least, just exploded. There was panic immediately from both the markets, from the media, from the public. What happened there? Why do you think there was such a pushback, and what ended up driving you out of that office so quickly?
So it's worth saying that I spent 10 years as a government minister. So I'd fought battles against the orthodoxy, against the bureaucracy for 10 years, whether it was the people in the education establishment that wanted to dumb down our curriculum, whether it was the judiciary who didn't like being challenged and didn't like their oligarchy being disrupted, whether it was the Treasury themselves. I was a Treasury minister for 2 years, and I believed that they had the wrong ideas on many issues. I'm a supply side, or I'm a monetarist, and yet the Treasury had been taken over by people who believed in net zero, people who believed in mass immigration, people who believed in Keynesian economics. It wasn't just the bureaucrats there, it was the bureaucrats of the Bank of England, which had been made independent by Gordon Brown, so it had been made unaccountable. So we had this very unaccountable bureaucracy. I had lots of fights. I was trade secretary. I managed to get 100 trade deals, or actually over 60 trade deals done, but it was always sort of fighting the system. So I thought when I got to the top, that I would be able to change things, that the things that held me back, surely the Prime Minister was able to get those things done. And as you say, the policies I put forward were sensible policies that would have delivered economic growth. Cutting taxes, keeping corporation tax low, getting on with fracking so that Britain could become energy independent again, We now have the highest energy costs in the developed world in Britain. It's killing our industry. We've just seen the last steel plant close. So I wanted to do those policies. And what I found was huge resistance from the Bank of England. So the day before we announced the policies, the Bank of England announced the sale of £40 billion worth of government gilts, which kind of spooked the markets. After the budget had been announced, and the budget was welcomed on the first day by people who actually ran businesses in Britain, because they recognised the country was overregulated, that we needed those supply side policies, that we needed cheaper energy, we needed lower taxes. But then there was a sort of turmoil in the markets because the pension funds were overexposed to these things called LDIs, which are a type of bet pension funds had made on interest rates being low for a very long time. Now, this is a complicated issue, and I didn't know anything about it before I became Prime Minister. But what happened was the Bank of England intervened in the market to deal with that pension fund issue, an issue that they were responsible for and they had failed to properly oversee. But they successfully blamed me and the mini budget for what had happened rather than them. And last year, they published a report saying 2/3 of the market movements in October 2022 were down to them and their failure to regulate LDIs, not the mini budget. But of course, last year it was too late. I'd already been pushed out of office. So it was a combination of the bureaucracy really hating my policies and wanting to use me as a scapegoat for their failures, plus the fact that Conservative MPs had spent 14 years not really being Conservative. So we had the highest immigration in our country for decades. Taxes were at a 70-year high. We hadn't done fracking. We pursued net zero in a very, a very zealous fashion. And the combination of the economic establishment being against what I was trying to do, plus Conservative MPs undermining me, I just couldn't continue in the job. And I was literally threatened with a inability of the British government to fund its own debt if I stayed in the job.
Was that the final straw? Because the difficult part for me to understand, and I am on the outside of it, but it seemed like it was almost mob rule, right? The mob was up in arms with what you wanted to do and was able to drive you out. But they...
Well, it was it wasn't a mob, it was an elite
Right.
mob.
It was the elite,
it was the
mob.
elite mob, and it was the...
So you could have stayed and tried to push them through.
No, I couldn't, because what I discovered was the Bank of England was very powerful. They were able to... They were constantly leaking to the press, so were the Treasury. They were undermining my credibility with the markets. And it's very, very difficult if you don't have the bureaucracy on your side. That is what is so difficult. So the conclusion I came to was if I had stayed in the job, it would have just resulted in continued market turmoil because they were actively undermining what I was doing. And this is why what I'm saying is in Britain, if we are to actually fix the really serious problems with our country, politicians need to be able to appoint the senior levels of bureaucrats. At the moment, they can't. If the US, the Treasury Secretary, he decides who the bureaucrats are at senior levels in the department. That is not true in Britain. And it's a massive problem. And here in the US, there is talk about the deep state. And obviously, Musk is doing a lot of work. Trump is doing a lot of work getting rid of bureaucrats who are actively undermining what they're trying to do. Well, the problem in Britain is virtually all of them were trying to do that.
What's incredible is, and you know this, that there's so many parallels of the same problem happening, not just in the United States, but all over the world, where we're seeing overreach of bureaucrats, of lifetime employees that nobody elected, really getting more and more power. And what's interesting is today in the United States, the pushback on the left is primarily against Elon Musk on this topic. And when you speak to them, really smart people, they'll get very quickly to the point that they're not criticizing the message, but the messenger. They don't like that he's not an employee. They don't like that he's not a bureaucrat. It's like a reverse an inverse of what people on the right like, right? They want to bring someone in that's not bogged down by these bureaucracies, that doesn't have these biases, is just going to come in and make these changes, or at least propose these changes that government can implement.
Well, what's extraordinary is they accuse Elon Musk of being unelected, but all the people they want to
Right.
make the decisions are unelected. And they've
Exactly.
been unelected, but they're not just unelected, they're unaccountable. Musk is accountable. Trump has hired him and Trump can fire him, and Trump was elected. But what the left want is they want unaccountable bureaucrats that can't be removed. So the governor of the Bank of England, who's done a terrible job, inflation has been rampant, hugely pushed up the money supply, it created massive problems to the British economy. He can't be fired by the government. And for the duration of his term, which is 8 years, an incredibly long time. So what has happened in democracies is accountability that used to rest with democratically elected politicians has been parceled out to, in Britain's case, the judiciary and also the unelected bureaucracy. And the public, whoever they voted for, end up getting the same policy. So what's happened in Britain is the public voted against the Conservative government because they weren't happy. They've now got the Labour government, but the same bureaucrats are in charge. The same judges are making the same sets of bad decisions as they were under the Conservative government. So the public are incredibly frustrated. They want big change in our country and they're not getting it. And this is why the left attacking Musk is so utterly ludicrous, because Musk is delivering what the people of America want and what they've been frustrated about for years and years and years.
Yeah, and what any reasonable person that would look at government and overspending of government, waste from government, would be in support of. But it's just, again, for me, it's about the messenger. It's about Trump. It's about Musk. Because of that, they don't like it.
But that's because they've got there are no logical reasons for them to object to what Musk is doing. So they move to personal attacks. They
Right.
say, oh, he looks silly, or he shouldn't have had his son in the press conference. That is classic diversion tactics by the left to stop talking about the real issue, which is elected officials understanding what money is being spent by the government. And I think it was a genius idea of Musk to actually go to the payment system. It's exactly what you do if you were going into a company where you think fraud is being committed. You'd
Right.
check the payment systems. And that is a genius idea. And I think it's something we should be looking at in Britain as to how we actually deal with the massive problem we've got of the unelected bureaucracy.
Yeah, so I hear you speaking. I'm trying to square it with something you said earlier, and help me understand the feelings on the streets in the UK, generally speaking. In the US and in so many countries around the world, there's this energy. In most places, it's a counter energy, but an energy nonetheless with DOGE, like with Elon Musk, Milei in Argentina, other movements that are more conservative. We call it common sense conservatives in my circles, because there's nothing extraordinary about what they're saying, but it's common sense. It's bringing things back. It's pushing back against these leftist policies. These leftist policies have been brought forward in so many Western countries. And you were saying earlier how hard it is now. You have this time because you have a leftist government in place in the UK to push those ideas to the public. Are we seeing that energy in the UK, sort of a counter energy against what the government there is pushing?
We are seeing a counter energy, and some of the reason the people were brought to book over their Facebook posts was the terrible murders that took place in Southport, the terrible terrorist attack in Southport of 3 young girls who were attending a Taylor Swift event. We saw people go out on the streets and demonstrate about this. Westminster is now full of tractors every week of farmers who are so angry that the government is trying to put on inheritance tax so they can't pass their farms on to the next generation. So we are seeing across British society, normal people incredibly frustrated with what is happening. But I think what the difference is between the UK and America is you've had the Tea Party movement, you've had the MAGA movement, you've had quite a long history of movements actually bringing these issues to attention, whereas that is fairly new in Britain. And the closest example is BREXIT. People
Sure.
voted for BREXIT because they wanted a massive change. It had a huge turnout. Loads of people who hadn't voted before came out and voted for BREXIT, and the establishment has basically squashed BREXIT. All the stuff we could have done differently, because we weren't part of the EU, we haven't done, because none of the establishment want things to really change. So I think in Britain, over the next few years, the country is going to get to a tipping point. I think we're behind the US, frankly. I think you've reached the tipping point, although Trump and Musk et al. Now have to deliver, which I know is a challenge. I tried to fight the establishment. I know how difficult it is. I know how devious they are. I know how personal their attacks are. But what I think is that because Donald Trump was in office in 2016, he understands the way they work, and he's now come back with a fully formed plan, a fully formed team. So there's a real chance to change things here.
Yeah, and all reports that I'm getting from people in the White House and around the White House is exactly that this time they're coming in, they have a plan, they know how to execute it, and they're making sure to avoid all these black holes in government.
See, I know where the black holes are.
Yes.
I spent 10 years learning about the black holes, falling into the black holes. I know where the black holes are, and this is what I think is needed in Britain. It is a Trump revolution. That's
Yeah,
what we need.
you mentioned Brexit. I spoke to our mutual friend Robert yesterday. He'll be happy that I give him a little shout out. And I said to him,
He is from the wrong side of the Pennines, of course.
that's what he likes to say about you, I think. But anyways, I don't know. I don't get this British humor. So the Accept Office Space, what's the show on for? The Office, I'm sorry. When we were talking about Brexit, I said, from my perspective, it looks like Brexit is dead. And it was like a useless exercise because I haven't seen the UK really make the changes, similar to you're saying, that they were looking to make. They did disassociate economically from the EU. But other than that, they're facing the same problems. And the one that I'd like to focus on is immigration and the rise of radical Islam in Britain and all over the United Kingdom. We've seen since October 7th, it's been even highlighted. It was a problem before then. Just masses and masses of radical Muslims, not everyday Muslims, radical Islamist Muslims on the streets marching for terror, making life miserable, not just for Jews, but for all Brits, for all normal thinking Brits, I think. So tell me the impact. You said you're behind the tipping point there. From my perspective, or let's just put it to you. How do you think the rise of Islamism in the UK and the basically open border policies that the UK has had for so many years is impacting the future of the UK?
It is the most serious threat to our country, is the threat of Islamism. And the same is true across continental Europe. So we're seeing a rise in crime against women and girls, a rise in the number of rapes. We have these appalling cases of the Pakistani grooming gangs preying on underage girls, being covered up, essentially because the Labour Party don't want to lose Muslim votes.
Can you tell us a little bit more about that? You've mentioned it on other interviews, but I don't think the American audiences really understand that.
This has been going on since at least the 1990s. What has happened is girls age 11, 12, 13, 14 have been groomed by men in the Pakistani community, largely, into sex. They've been tortured. They've been raped. In some cases, they've been killed. And some of the perpetrators have been brought to justice, but they haven't had very long prison sentences, and some of them are out again. There's evidence the local police were complicit. So 2 members of the South Yorkshire Police were found to have participated in what happened. There is evidence that local councils and local councillors were complicit and were aware about what was going on. And the government have refused to have a public inquiry, even though it's estimated that 100,000 girls could have been involved. I mean, it's on a huge scale.
Help me understand
An
why.
absolutely huge scale.
Meaning, why would the government not want to have a public inquiry?
So Labour lost 4 seats to Islamist separatists at the last election. And these are people who advocate for Sharia law in Britain. They advocate for the end of Israel. They are extremists. And many Labour MPs are facing, because they have large Muslim communities in their constituency, they're facing losing to the Islamists. So they're appeasing them rather than defending those girls who have suffered so much across our country. I mean, it's revolting.
Wow. I mean, if you think of the issues we've been having in the United States in this last election, when we were thinking that the line that us on the right were saying was that the only 2-state solution that Biden thinks about is Michigan and Minnesota, right, to appease that small group of electors, voters and electoral votes. And obviously that didn't work out for him. This seems like that to the extreme, right? I mean, just the government is just ignoring, as you're saying,
It is, but there are
ignoring the masses.
other issues as well, not just the Labour Party, but our policing is not properly accountable. Our judiciary is not properly accountable, and it's because back in the 2000s, Tony Blair passed laws essentially removing the rights of elected politicians to appoint senior judges and instead giving it to an independent body. So we now have a judiciary that is not properly accountable to Parliament, and it's been a disaster. So just one decision that was announced this week, migrants from Gaza will be able to come to the UK through the Ukrainian refugee scheme. This was a decision not made by any MP in Parliament. It was made by judges, allowing probably some of the most dangerous Islamists to get into our country via a backdoor route. And that decision was made by the judiciary. So we have a very serious accountability problem. And we've also got a very, very serious problem with the Labour Party pandering to extreme Islamism. But I don't want people to think the situation is hopeless. It's not hopeless. The British people are absolutely horrified by what's been happening in our country. They are massively frustrated. The grooming gangs are getting huge attention on things like X. The problem is it's not being covered by the mainstream media. So what I want to see is more of a development of an independent media like you have in the US, things like this excellent podcast, Joe Rogan, etc., to shine a light on what's happening in Britain. So there's real pressure. And as I say, we're seeing pressure building. We are seeing people protesting. We are seeing, whether it's the farmers, whether it's people in Southport, there is a palpable frustration. And I think the country does need that change.
It's incredible. Now in this new Trump administration, Trump 47, I think for the first time ever, we're seeing independent media outlets, podcasters, et cetera, getting press credentials, even in the White House, in the press room, which is unheard of. As you're talking about the judicial issues, it reminds me of the issues, and we don't have to get into it, but in Israel, which is a copy of the British system, and they have the same exact issue with the self-selecting judiciary, that you can't get them out, and there's no jurisdictional boundaries of what they can rule upon, and they're a court of first instance, so they can just do kind of whatever they want. Go ahead.
But in Britain, we do have, the British Constitution is based on the idea of parliamentary sovereignty. Ultimately, is MPs who vote for the law. And that is, Parliament has to demand its rights back.
Right.
It has to demand its sovereignty back. Otherwise, the country will be in serious trouble because people vote for a new government and they're not getting a new government because the same bureaucrats, the same problems that we're having with the judicial system are still there.
Tell me how you see U.S.-UK relations under Trump. If countries all over the world, leaders, kind of, they don't know how to deal with Trump. They're a little bit afraid of him. They definitely respect him. And there's a lot of pushback from different leaders. Tell me how you see it with this left-wing government in the
Donald
UK.
Trump loves Britain. His mother's Scottish. He loves Britain. He's got a number of golf courses, Trump Turnberry, various operations across the UK. And he is a big fan of the monarchy, our late Queen. He's very, very supportive of Britain. And the frustration is we've got this government who are anti-Trump, who are leftists, who are appeasing, if they're not appeasing Islamism, they're trying to give away the Chagos Islands, which are an important military base that supports Western freedom. They're embarrassed about Britain, and they are fundamentally not aligned politically with what Donald Trump is trying to do in America. They're trying to do the opposite. They're trying to remove the freedom of speech, and we've got a massive problem with that. They're trying to stop any oil and gas exploration, whereas Donald Trump wants to drill, baby drill.
Right.
So it's very frustrating that we've got a terrible government just at this moment where there could be a very positive relationship between Donald Trump and the UK government. But what I would like to see is I'd love to see a UK-US trade deal. I'd love to see us move away from the European over-regulated orbit and have a trade deal with the US. I'd like us to dump our terrible net zero policies and get on with fracking. So I hope that that is what Donald Trump is going to be pushing for in any dealings he has with.
Do you see a trade deal being possible with this
Yeah.
government?
Well, a trade deal is definitely possible. And I was trade secretary when Donald Trump was last in office, and we made a lot of progress, in the negotiations. The problem was too many people in the bureaucracy in the Conservative Party didn't want to do a deal with America. There were all these myths perpetrated about chlorinated chicken and hormone injected beef and how terrible it would be. I mean, the British establishment, they hated Brexit. They want to be close to Europe. They think there's something a bit vulgar about America. I'm the opposite. I think America is a great country. I'm very proud of the role that the UK had in the establishment of the US. I mean, some of our ideas like Magna Carta and Bill of Rights were the forebear documents to the American Constitution. I'm so proud of that. But there's too many people in Britain who are not proud of it, and most of them are in the establishment. That's no reflection of the average British person who's actually very pro-American.
Yeah, and this government has been, from a personal perspective, I think there's also a lot of parallels with the rest of the issues we've been talking about. But this current government, the prime minister, suspending arms sales to Israel, not all arms sales, but selective arms sales. What message do you think he and the government in the UK was trying to send by doing that?
Well, first of all, there's a problem with our Foreign Office. Our Foreign Office is unfortunately anti-Israel, and they have the same attitude as a lot of academia, a lot of the traditional foreign policy establishment in Britain. And I fought that as Foreign Secretary. As Prime Minister, I wanted to move our embassy to Jerusalem. I wanted to take a much more pro-Israel stance, but I was fighting against a foreign policy establishment that were fundamentally anti-Israel. Just one example, there was a vote taking place at the UN Human Rights Council. I found out that officials were planning to vote in favor of an anti-Israel line. I said to them, I don't want to do that. We need to support Israel. This is an anti-Semitic motion. I'm not happy with it. They said, but Minister, we'll be isolated. And I said, well, I don't really care if we're isolated. And I pushed them. We went ahead with the vote. I had to get it cleared by number 10. This is what I didn't have to get voting along with what they wanted cleared with number 10. I just had to get voting. This is how it works. And when we voted in favor of Israel, we were followed by the French and Germans because they saw our leadership and wanted to be supportive of Israel. So this is what I'm telling you. The whole British bureaucracy will push in the wrong direction until it is challenged. And I think that's partly what happened with the arms sales embargo. And in fact, there was a civil servant who resigned from the arms control department because he said it was too pro-Israel. And this is somebody who's meant to be impartial, saying, I'm resigning from the arms control department because of what's happening in Gaza and I don't like Israel. That's the problem. So it's very deep rooted in our system.
Yeah, and you're seeing it on the streets. I have many friends from the UK, and recently I had one friend, I won't name her in case she doesn't want to be on the podcast, but a well-known woman from the UK who's very involved in lots of great things and a barrister. And we sat at a coffee shop down the street here, and I wear a kippah on my head. I've been wearing one for about 3 years. And she's looking around and she says, I'm baffled. I said, by what? And she said, I see people walking here with kippahs on their head, with Jewish stars. I see hostage posters on traffic lights. This is already, a
I've
year
actually
after.
seen a lot of
Yeah.
Stand with Israel posters.
Stand with Israel posters, hostage posters, and everyone seems to be proud and open and Jewish, and we don't see that in England anymore. And I looked up a little bit the data, and last year there was a big report that came out, and most of it is not surprising. One was 3 out of 4 Jews in the United Kingdom feel less safe now than they did before October 7th. And that number's probably higher. That last 25% probably hadn't left their house. But is the UK still safe for Jews?
Yes, it is, but I want to see more being done. There are some instances. So, for example, a Jewish man was trying to cross the road when there was an Islamic protest taking place, and the police did not deal with that well at all. The country in general is not as safe as it should be, and we have a problem with crime and policing. I told you about the terrible issue with sexual violence. What I'm concerned about is the police treating Islamic protesters with kid gloves and not really being tough because they fear being seen as racist, and that so there's an issue with double standards in treatment. But what I want to say is the vast majority of British people are very pro-Israel and very supportive of the Jewish community, and we have a problem with a small subset of society. In the same way as you've seen some pretty appalling attacks on Jewish students on American university campuses. So it's the same thing. And one thing I wanted to mention is, of course, what's been exposed at USAID, that a lot of the media that has been pumping out some of these anti-Israel messages, like the BBC, has actually been funded by USAID. So this is a problem that we're facing that crosses borders, that this kind of anti-Israel, essentially anti-Semitic culture has been fostered using taxpayers' money, which is shocking.
Yeah, and whenever we see it here in the United States or in the UK or anywhere else. Whenever you see anti-Israel culture, policies, etc., you're also seeing it's always tied together with anti-West, anti-capitalist, and all these things that
And
that
Israel
are so important.
Israel is the front line of freedom. It's the front line of freedom. If we don't defend Israel, we will lose the West.
Well, thank you so much, Liz Truss. It's an honor to have you here
Great
in
to
our
be on your
studio.
show.
I think I can talk to you for hours upon hours, but I promise not to pull a Joe Rogan interview. And thank you so much. I look forward to speaking with you further.
Thanks very much.
Thanks, everyone else. Make sure to like, subscribe, follow, and do all the great things you do to support podcasts. And we'll see you next time.